Well, May 18 was the day Labor realised it was not in a strong position in the lead up to the election. It had lost what many thought was the unlosable election. Fast forward to November, and now the party has come up with the reasons why, even though some on the night were already issuing some warnings. So what does it come up with? Well, it's pretty comprehensive. It doesn't single out one particular factor, but does highlight a few main ones. If we go through some of those points, Bill Shorten's unpopularity contributed to the loss. No persuasive election strategy either. No simple policy narrative during the election. Anti-coal and Adani rhetoric costed, in particular in some seats in New South Wales and Queensland as well. So these are the main areas Labor are highlighting, not wanting to single out one in particular, but of course it does lead to questions about Bill Shorten and his future. Just ahead of this officially being released, Bill Shorten did offer his own take on things in a tweet that he reflected on the election loss for himself as well. He did reflect on what might have been, but said, well, you don't essentially get reruns in these elections. Bill Shorten tweeting out today, were the universe to grant reruns, I would campaign with fewer messages. If we can get the graphic up here on the screen, were the campaign to run, I would campaign with fewer, get reruns, I would campaign with fewer messages, more greatly emphasise the jobs, opportunities and renewable energies and take a different position on franking credits. So he has singled out one particular policy there. In 2018 I presided over a bigger tax cut plan and Liberals for 10 million working Australians, but I concede with hindsight when they matched ours we should have gone bigger again. So he is singling out particular policy elements he thinks could have perhaps changed that election result. What do the people that were in charge of this think? Well, joining me now is Jay Weatherill, one of the authors of the report, and of course, former South Australian Premier. Jay Weatherill, thanks very much for your time. We've gone through briefly a few of the points within this review. Yes, it talks about Bill Shorten, policies, a weak strategy as well. Is there one factor that stands out for you?
I think it is the lack of a strategy. I mean, it seems elementary, but there was no campaign committee which would formulate strategy. And this is largely because of the role of expectations. There was such a strong view that Labor was likely to win the election. There didn't seem any attention that was given to the simple, clear message. In fact, it was a bit the other way around. Because there were such strong expectations of a victory, the view was that we should be seeking a mandate for a whole range of policies without giving any real thought to the way in which those policies should be characterised. And they were characterised as a threat to the economy, that frightened low-income workers who very much rely upon a strong economy for their job security, and they voted against us in substantial numbers.
That seems like an extraordinary act of hubris. Everyone knows that Labor were election favourites and plenty of journalists thought they'd win, but not to form that committee just because of confidence?
Well, I think the point was from the perspective of the leadership. They had very strong objective evidence that everybody, I think, shared, that Labor was heading towards a victory. So I don't think there was... It was a bit like whatever's our strategy is, it seems to be working. Of course, that changed very suddenly with the election of Scott Morrison as leader. So the inability to adapt to the new leader, things that were working against the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, criticisms of essentially him being from the big end of town, didn't work against Scott Morrison, who'd effectively recast himself as a much more ordinary, everyday Australian.
So who's that on, not forming that committee?
Well, it's collective responsibility. I mean, I don't think you can hang this on any one person. I mean, all of these decisions that were taken, it needs to be understood, they were taken collectively. There was no real dissent about the approach that was taken, but they've all combined to
But I mean, it's not a backbencher saying let's not form a committee, for example. What's the normal process for that being formed, and why wasn't that followed?
I mean, the truth is that there were various committees. It's just that none of them had a very clear strategic focus. I mean, you've got to remember, during that crazy period in the last couple of years before the federal election, there were by-elections, there were change in leaders. So every time there was the Liberal Party was in such a mess that every time the Labor Party started to think about its own positioning, the Liberal Party crashed in with a new disaster. So You know,
All right.
and a lot of and there could be election any time, and so there was a lot of tactical thinking, but not a lot of strategic thinking.
Casting forward some of the lessons here, you do go to policy. Essentially, the message on climate policy is to hold the line, not back down on this. What could this mean in an emissions target sense?
Well, that's a matter for the party. I mean, what we haven't been asked to comment on particular policies except to measure their electoral impact. So we discussed what the effect of these policies were, and obviously it was devastating in Queensland. The anti-Adani proposition there hurt us a lot. But you need to consider the counterfactual. If the Labor Party were to abandon its commitment to taking action on climate change, it would be catastrophic for it in terms of its values and for many of the people that frankly actually supported Labor. So those swings to Labor in certain areas, which we put down to our climate change policy. So now what the precise policy is, that's a matter for Anthony Albanese and the party.
Would,
and he did
would
lay
going
down
all the way back
some
to
markers
the
other
coalition's... Yeah, but going all the way to the coalition's emissions target, would that be effectively laying down arms on climate?
Look, I'm not going to comment on any particular policy offering except to say that strong action on climate change is a core Labor value and cannot be abandoned, and we don't recommend that it is.
Bill Shorten and his unpopularity was cited. Would it be unwise to make him leader again in the future?
Well, look, Bill Shorten's unpopularity was only one contributing factor, and we also need to remember that during the campaign he won each of the 3 debates. He campaigned energetically and was massively targeted with negative advertising from, in particular, Clive Palmer. So there was a massive spend which eclipsed even the Labor Party and the Liberal Party spend that were directed at him. So his standing was negatively affected, there's no doubt about that. But Bill's future is a matter for him, and we make no personal criticism of him. We think that he wasn't unelectable. We think, in fact, he should have won the election. But there were obviously other profound failings in the campaign.
Right. But so not unelectable, and you don't feel as though that should be a tag that goes on him in the future, unelectable, despite having lost 2 elections?
No, of course not. No.
You mentioned the advertising, and the review singles out Clive Palmer as crowding out Labor's message. It calls for the party to pursue capping individual political donations. What would that mean? Anyone making a political donation, even as part of a party, would face a certain cap?
Well, the precise design would be a matter for the federal party, but there is a model in South Australia which involves spending caps, where we make it conditional on the receipt of public funding. That's one possible mechanism, but there are others. I know Queensland is considering spending caps at the moment in its state parliament. So there are different models, but we think that it's a threat to democracy to have one rich individual that could have such a profound effect on the election campaign. Now, we don't say it was decisive, but we say it was very important. The other element of that is the lies, the spreading of the death tax through social media. We believe there should be truth in advertising legislation in elections. Once again, South Australia does have a model for that, but there might be other models and ways in which we can attack that.
Okay. I want to get to that in a moment, but just on the cap, is there a figure you have in mind? Because you say that the threat is essentially one against democracy. Where does it need to be set?
Well, look, that becomes a matter of debate, but the idea that a billionaire can wander into the campaign and outspend both major parties, that's got to be a concern in a democracy. Most people aren't necessarily aware of
that sounds like it'd be quite a high cap.
Where these ads are coming from.
Talking like this sort of, you know, $50 million is a crazy amount in Australian politics, but if someone tips in $1 million, that wouldn't be.
Look, that's a matter for debate, but I think we saw 70 million in the last week or 2 of the campaign. If you look at the Labor's share of voice, it dramatically shrunk. So you had the coalition and Clive Palmer essentially running the same message, crowding out the Labor message in a way which is powerful. I mean, the reason parties advertise is it works. So you cannot say it didn't have an effect.
You mentioned truth in advertising. Where would this sort of reform leave Labor's Mediscare campaign of 2016?
Would have to run the gauntlet. If it couldn't meet the test of not being false or misleading, it would be the subject of a declaration by an electoral commissioner to that effect, and that can have a its own powerful electoral effect. It's happened in South Australian politics. I know it has a chilling effect on the way in which the very party secretaries approve materials in South Australia. I've seen that happen with my own eyes. And that's a good thing. People should think twice about putting out false and misleading material, and it should be the subject of adverse comment by an independent regulatory authority.
But you've singled out the death tax and what happened there. Is it fair enough to put Mediscare in the same basket?
I don't know. It would have to run the gauntlet of that test.
But you'd have to say there were never any plans to sell off Medicare, however you might even do that. This campaign based on possibly privatising the payment system. I mean, if you're going to call out the death tax, don't you have to call out what happened in a previous election as well?
Well, we've asked to analyse the 2019 election, but this would apply to both parties. And I think it's a good thing if there's a high bar. Look, I think the Labor Party survives best in a high trust environment. We're the ones that want to alter the status quo. We're the party of social reform. We need a high trust environment. So I think it's good for the Labor Party to impose this discipline on itself.
In a broad sense, you think that bold policies are okay, but fewer of them. So this essentially speaks to a smaller target, if not a small target, for the next campaign?
Well, it's more really, you can't have so many policies that they all crowd each other out. I mean, some of our candidates were flat out keeping up with our announcements, and some of them were coming so late they couldn't even publicise them. And of course their cumulative effect was such that it was able to be representative of the massive tax agenda coming at people. So it scared people when they saw this. And look, frankly, it was hard to understand. Some of them were actually too complex. They were too difficult to understand. So that's really the boldness. You can have a small agenda, but it might be profound and ambitious. It doesn't.
Okay,
The
so
number
it's a
of
complexity
policies
issue.
Doesn't necessarily.
All right.
Yeah, it's a complexity question.
I want to ask you finally, Jay Weatherill, this report also said that women were underrepresented in campaign teams. Should you have had a woman in the review team? There
were two women in the review team, so it was a 6-person team. Craig and I were the co-authors, but there were 2 other women involved in the process. And of course, amongst the 1,000 of people that we contacted either personally or in submissions, many of them were women.